stories, emotions, culture, values, games, imagination, breathing, digestion, memory, attention, making sense of the world, connection, myths, legends, art, creativity, music, dancing, daily routines, coping mechanisms, language, rules, concepts of luck. These are all examples of elements of the human experience that span across time and all of humanity, all of culture. No matter what context you are from or were born into, as human beings, there are certain factors that we all inevitably experience. While individual experience is obviously extremely important, at the end of the day, I actually think it's a really cool thing to realize that we're connected by the fact that we're all wicked human. Hello, and welcome to the Wicked Human podcast. I am your host, Morgan.monet, and I am really excited to talk to y'all today about just kind of a general introduction into what this podcast is going to be all about and the things we're going to be focusing on, kind of the lens and approach we're going to be looking at things from. It has been a long time in the making, something I've been wanting to do and considering for years, but the time is finally right, and I feel ready to share more of my mind and my heart with y'all. But as far as some of the specifics of what have led me here, maybe that's a story for another day. This podcast will attempt to explain and demonstrate why it actually makes sense to give ourselves the space to embrace our humanness and to extend the same to others, particularly by way of allowing differences and actually celebrating and embracing the fact that as human beings, no two of us will have the same experience, and thus it's actually a connective factor. It will be a format where we hopefully learn together how to embrace our humanness in a world and in a society that, to be totally honest, and this may just be my personal bias coming through, but tell me if you relate or resonate with what I'm saying, I believe we live in a world that is stealing our humanness from us, whether it's intentional or not. A lot of the opportunities that humankind throughout history has had to connect with themselves, with nature, with each other, they are being stripped from us. The current day and age that we live in is making it extremely, extremely difficult to be a human being and thrive in the ways that humans have thrived historically, because we are negating and ignoring a lot of those fundamental aspects and common factors of being human. So that's kind of what I'm here to promote, is an emphasis, acceptance towards our humanness. We live in a society that expects us to be attending to these kind of higher level needs, but we aren't often recognizing some of the most basic and fundamental needs that we have, like going outside and not staring at a screen constantly. There are changes that are happening in 2024 that are making it more difficult to connect with that human element of being alive. And these are some of the things that I want to address in this podcast. I want it to be a place where we're looking at the common factors of being human, but I want to explore those things while having a very present awareness to the fact that we live in the modern world that we live in, that we are in 2024, and that there are very unique challenges that come with today's society, and I think we can all agree on that. We're going to address issues of our modern society from the perspective of a Gen Zer. I am a proud member of Gen Z. I think our generation gets a lot of unnecessary shit, and we're not quite understood, and we're living in a world that is completely unprecedented, so I don't think we're given all the credit that we deserve for, like, having to navigate living in a world that is ever evolving and rapidly changing and actually quite demanding at this point. I'm sure a lot of us can relate to that. But I honestly see Gen Z as emotionally intelligent and sensitive and aware and empathetic towards the issues and struggles of others. And I love that for Gen Z. I was born in 1997. I know that generations are defined differently from source to source, but from what it seems like, I am pretty generalizably a member of Gen Z. I am definitely like on the older end of Gen Z, but I love our generation. I think we're cute. I think we're poppin', and I will say that I'm not very up with a lot of the lingo. Social media is something I, as a zillennial, have had a difficult adjustment to, and I do relate with that term zillennial a lot, because I do think I understand a lot of kind of both sides of, I mean, growing up in a world where social media and screens were not necessarily, I mean, yeah, that was not the norm yet. So I've seen both kind of existences, and I think for that reason, I have a different relationship with social media and my phone than maybe many of my peers of Gen Z would say that they do. But I think that also gives me, like, reason to want to speak to Gen Z, and this podcast is not just geared towards Gen Z. If you resonate with what I'm saying, no matter what your age is, no matter what generation you're from, please, like, tune in, because I'm going to be speaking to whoever it is that feels connected in any ways, who the idea that we have more in common than we might acknowledge societally or connects with any of the messages that I say. I want to speak to anyone. But Gen Z specifically, as one of your oldest members, I implore you, seriously, to give what I have to say, and what my future guests that I will be bringing on that I'm really excited about, what they will have to say. If there's anything I understand, it's that with humans, they're unpredictable, complex, and you really can't know people until you know a specific person. But overall, in terms of the generalized experience and in terms of these human common factors that contribute to wellness across time, I do feel like I have a good understanding of those. So in that sense, I think that I have some ideas that can hopefully contribute to human wellness. I feel like this is a pretty good segue into a topic that is really important for me to address in this introduction video, which is my awareness of my privilege as a white person in America. Another thing that human beings have in common, every single one of us, is that we do not get to choose the bodies that we are born into. Does that mean that we don't experience things in a certain way because of the bodies we're born into? No, that definitely does influence our experience, influence our interpretations and feelings about things. Absolutely. White people in America have systemic and historical levels of privilege that, while I don't have control over them, my experiences are influenced by those things. I realize that a lot of my worldview is probably shaped by the fact that I am experiencing the world as a person who's white. Because of all this, though, I do feel very committed to amplifying the voices of others. And I don't mean that in like a cliche way. I really do recognize that as a white person, my voice is needed only so much, and in fact, that has kind of deterred me at times from wanting to speak about some of the things that I want to share, because I wonder if other people of color specifically, if it would be more important for their voices to be heard. And I do think it is. I think that marginalized populations and people that are systemically oppressed, we should be listening to their voices the most. I also understand that acknowledging white privilege is only the first step in actually creating societal change, and it's important to me to use this podcast to explore ways to make that happen, ways to create a more just and equitable society. Truly, that is my goal. Throughout my episodes here and as I interview folks in the future, which I'm really excited about, if I have not mentioned that already, I'm probably a broken record about it, but I'm just really excited to have people on here and not just be talking in a room by myself. But we will definitely be acknowledging throughout our conversations power dynamics and privilege and just societal issues in general that exist in today's modern world. So I am going to really try my best to be informed and thoughtful and aware of what I need to be aware of, but I'm also human, and that is part of why I think this platform actually can be helpful. It's also part of why I switched from the therapy field to the field of coaching, because I feel like it gives me more of a permission to present my humanness and to acknowledge with the people I'm working with that we're both human. And I actually think that's a major part of what contributes to healing and change for folks. I don't feel that I know better than anyone, even though I do have education and experience in some of these topics. That doesn't mean that I think that everything that has worked for me or even worked for the people that I've been able to help over the years will work for you. And that's okay. That is part of being human. Different things work for different people. We're all so unique in those very deep ways. I think it's just fair to say that in general, people are more than they may seem. We cannot ever know someone's full story just by looking at them. And that's actually something that I believe is fascinating and interesting about humanity, that no matter who you come across in life, if you don't know them, you don't know them. You may have an idea of stereotypes around certain qualities that they present. You may make assumptions, but in all reality, just by looking at someone, you could never know their story. And I think that's cool. And I am excited to use this platform to kind of invite some of those stories and to get to know people in a way that just by looking at them on the street, you would not be able to know them. Two things can be true at once. This is an idea that with the people I work with, if you've ever worked with me before, you probably know this is an idea that I can't shut up about. But it is just true that even when things seem conflicting or contradictory, two things can be true at once. And this includes discussions around privilege. While someone may experience privilege in certain ways, it's not unlikely or impossible, at least, that they may also experience disadvantages or struggles in other ways. I see all of this, and I want to use my voice in ways that feel inclusive, moral, and congruent with me. So that's my kind of commitment that I'm putting out there. I want to be a voice that amplifies those of others as well. Okay, so I started today's video by listing some examples of common factors, universals among humans, but let's dive into a little bit more of some of the kind of general categories that exist as far as human factors. I keep calling them those. I don't think that's actually the term, but human factors for short, if you ask me. I'm going to go through some of the categories of those that across humanity, across time, they are just seen from research and from statistics to be shown as commonalities, as things that are just inherent to the human experience. Research has found hundreds, if not thousands, of these common factors, and it's something that has been pretty extensively studied, both quantitatively and qualitatively. We know that there are certain elements of humanity that, no matter what your background is, no matter what your personal story is, these things exist. I will never be one to negate the importance or the validity of personal experience and individual perspectives that are unique to each person. But I do think that it's important and actually really connecting as people to recognize that there are things that are just common to the human experience. And these common factors of being human and being alive, I think are worth focusing on because they inform our understanding, first of all, of just what it means to be human and what those things are that are going to contribute to our well-being. And second of all, they are indicators of things that are shared experiences between ourselves and everyone else that's currently living and everyone else that has ever lived. Not to be dramatic, but I just think that's a cool way of thinking about things, that as a species, there are universals and things that are inevitable to experience. This podcast is going to be all about highlighting personal understandings and perspectives about those common factors. So I'm never going to be here to pretend like just because there are these universals that exist, that means every human experience is the same, because that could not be further from the truth. But I do think that it wouldn't hurt, and my intention here is to look at things under the lens of understanding that there are certain things about being alive and being human that we can all connect over and relate to. Naturally, those are things that are important to understand because they're the things that are biologically and deeply wired into us. Why wouldn't we want to understand those things more and to give other people permission and space to exist in their human experience just as we are? I look forward to using this platform as a way to learn about those unique perspectives and to dive into ways that living as a human in 2024 present differently from person to person. But ultimately, I feel like it's important to fall back on the lens of realizing that as human beings, we have more in common than we think we do when it comes to biology, psychology, social organization, cultural practices, all these types of categories. Researchers have identified numerous commonalities across humanity. There's really no way of quantifying how many universals really exist because it's just way too complex of a topic. There's no way to really say or even draw a line in a black and white way of like what is absolutely true of everyone and what is true of most people. And some of what we'll talk about in this show, in this podcast, will be somewhere in that realm of either it's something that for the most part, and there can be exceptions, humans experience, and then there are other things like basic fundamental needs for survival that I don't think vary really quite at all, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But first, let's go through some like just these general categories of common human factors between people. Let's start with culture and cultural identity, because our cultures, of course, make us different from one another, but they also serve as a sort of umbrella that we all fall under because we all do exist within cultures. I'm not trying to be here like preaching that we are all the same because we're all part of human culture. That's not really what I mean, although I do think that because culture and these other things that we'll get into more are common amongst all of us, I think that does serve as a tool for connection. We recognize that as human beings, we all have a need to belong and we all have a need for a sense of cultural identity. So I'm not saying that we are all the same because we're all human. I mean, that is also kind of what I'm saying in a sense, but I'm not ignorant to the fact that cultures vary vastly and that people's values, morals, and behaviors that align with said cultures present in totally different ways. And that's okay. What I'm trying to say is that we should accept each other for interpreting the world in the way that they do, because we are also, as they are, interpreting the world in our own way. We are all in an active and ongoing process, whether we are conscious of it or not, of telling ourselves certain stories, of making sense of the world around us, of belief. We all have belief. That is definitely another common factor amongst humans. And even for those who might say, no, I'm not a spiritual person, I don't really believe in anything. That is your belief. We all have a way of making sense of what's going on around us, and whether that's simply pure science or whether that is making space for a spiritual component, we all have beliefs, we all are telling ourselves stories, and we've all gotten to the place that we're at now of telling ourselves the story that we do in this given moment because of every little thing we've ever experienced. And to expect two people to have the same experience or to arrive at the same point would be completely impossible. We can't sway another person to see things in the same way that we do. And I think there is an emphasis in today's society on trying to force people into our reality. And it makes sense because reality exists in the mind. We only really know things from our own lens and from our own perspective. So when we believe so fully that we have the answers that work for us and we care about other people, it makes sense that people want to invite others to see things in a similar way. But I'm kind of here to say that what if the similar way of seeing things is that we accept that we will never all see things in the same way? I'm not trying to oversimplify the complexity that comes with societal, systemic, and political disagreements, but what if this was the lens we as a society adopted? What if we decided to realize that as human beings, there are things that connect us, and let's try to focus on what we have in common and what we can relate on rather than defaulting to division or conflict. Okay, so that was a bit of a tangent on culture, but I felt like it was an important place to start. Let me quickly run through some other general kind of categories of common factors between humans. Okay, I have some of these written down. I'm just going to quickly read through some of them. This is from some of the research that I did leading up to this about what we do know and what researchers have found so far about these human common factors. So let's quickly run through some of them. Language, socialization. Humans are social beings and engage in processes of socialization to learn cultural standards and to figure out what's acceptable behavior. Some specific common factors under that are division of labor, social groups, the family, kinship systems, kind of similar to the family. Ethnocentrism, so this idea that kind of like the world revolves around us, or that where we are looking at the world from is like the perspective. Play, exchange, cooperation, reciprocity. There are all sorts of things that even amongst these categories, there's kind of more specifics that exist among people. Is that not interesting? Okay, another main category, tool use, emotions, happiness, sadness, anger, fear, surprise, which play an important role in social communication and just overall relationships. The mind, within the mind we have empathy, we have psychological defense mechanisms. There's all sorts of things that people across time and culture have experienced within the mind. Behavior, which includes gestures, facial expressions, and even aggression. And not to go too much off topic here, but aggression is a good example of kind of these more difficult or painful elements of humanity that we're also going to acknowledge on this podcast. We know what it feels like to physically experience pain, emotionally experience pain. I'm not trying to just breeze over the painful or difficult elements of humanity to focus on the positive. I think it's really important to integrate both, to realize that, again, two things can be true at once. Okay, let's keep going with this. So, other categories, social hierarchies, music and dance. I think we listed that earlier in the podcast. Art and creativity, that as well. Cooperation and reciprocity, love that. Of course, I would be remiss not to acknowledge that as human beings, we have basic, just fundamental survival needs. And I think a lot of us are probably familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is a little bit outdated in the sense that it doesn't acknowledge as much the cultural elements that come with needs and varying prioritizations from group to group or from person to person as far as which needs are most important. So that is like kind of the standard reference when it comes to needs of humans. But I do think it's important to continue these conversations because there are more elements that in our modern society maybe aren't acknowledged in such an oversimplified hierarchy of needs. But let's talk about some of what those needs are. Physiological needs like food, water, shelter, and sleep. Safety and security needs like having protection from physical harm or threats to one's well-being. Love and belongingness. Humans are social beings and we require secure attachments and acceptance and belonging. Meaning and purpose are also often considered fundamental human needs. We, as human beings, seek to understand and to make meaning of what our experience is about here. We thrive when we have a sense of purpose. Exploring existential and spiritual questions is a commonality among people and is done in, of course, vastly different ways. But the ultimate question of what are we doing here and where do we go after this? All of these like kind of deep existential questions, these are inevitable elements of being a human being. I will say that I do consider myself a spiritual person. I am not religious at this point in my life while I did grow up in religion, but I have a very deep sense of spirituality, and that is, for me, an important part of my meaning making and my understanding of purpose and everything. But that does not mean that I expect other people to see things the same way as me, and I actually think that connection comes from seeing our differences human to human and accepting each other in spite of them, maybe not even in spite of them, but because of them. Like, I think that is something that is possible, is to start to look at things in that way, to recognize that because we all have our own beliefs and our own frame of reference for understanding this world, we also can have empathy for one another because we're all just doing our best to find that meaning and purpose. Another human universal is learning, as well as connection with nature. These are things that are observable and recorded across history. So I mean, every single one of these categories is something that we could dive into more deeply and explore with more specific questions in mind, and that is truly what I hope to do in this format, is to have people on to talk about specific categories of human common factors and from the lens of people's personal experiences and the context of being in this day and age in 2024, explore those things and make space for non-conforming or different ways of looking at things that might challenge us all to think in a new way or to open up our minds to the possibility that there are other realities that exist, that there are multiple perspectives that can be true at the same time. And that truly is what's going to lead to, in my mind, social and systemic harmony and belonging. So in sum, and I know we didn't go super into depth into any of those, but that is exactly what I plan to do in the future. There are factors that unite us from person to person that just by way of being alive, we are experiencing. Regardless of our stories, our beliefs, our personal interpretations or feelings about things, there are certain things that we need in order to survive and to be safe and to be well. And I want to explore those. I want to focus on those while also making room for the nuances of today's world. This is a podcast where I want to learn alongside you about diverse perspectives and experiences of being human. I want to talk about ways that these common factors present themselves in different ways, but also in ways that we can relate to, in ways that we can see ourselves reflected in. Statistics and research are important, and those are things that I want to take into account and plan to throughout this podcast. Yet my emphasis will always be the individual, the unique experiences and stories, because while statistics, of course, are important, those are only generalizations about humanity, and in order to get a deeper look and insight into actual human beings, actual individuals, you have to ask them. You can't look at a number on a research study and assume that you understand a person. You might understand patterns, but the way I see it is that until you ask a specific person questions, you cannot truly understand their experience, and that's okay. That's, again, one of our commonalities, our diversity, and the fact that none of us can be looked at and fully understood just by the way that we present ourselves physically. That's something that connects us. That's something that should give us empathy for one another. We are all a product of our unique experiences, our individual upbringings, our childhoods, our biology, our environments, our belief about whether we belong or not. These are the things that make us up and create like the fabric that is each person. So how could we ever expect two people to be the same? It is quite literally impossible, absolutely impossible for two people to have the same experience or interpretation of the world around them. I am not asking anyone to default to the assumption that people are good. While that is kind of like my personal bias and my hope and belief about people in general, I just love people and like see them as good. I'm not even asking y'all to do that. What I am asking and inviting people to do is to consider the fact that you could not possibly fucking know. If there are infinite ways of experiencing this world, which in my mind and in my understanding of things, there is no way for two people to not have a distinct human experience. And if that's true, then who are we to tell people that their interpretation of the world around them or their belief system or what brings them comfort and meaning is wrong? There is such a tendency to want to bring other people into our reality and to convince them that we are right or that we see things in the most ethical or moral way. What if instead we could focus on giving other people space to be them and to exist in life in a way that feels congruent and authentic and aligned with their actual experience? Why would that not make sense? At the same time, this does not mean that just because I'm kind of seeing things from this lens of sameness and commonality, that does not mean I'm not going to stand up for issues that are just straight up harming people. I'm not going to just kind of cover my eyes or throw my hands up because I want to focus on the things that we have in common that's also not what I'm here to do. And I plan and realize that I will need to take a stand on certain things and advocate for people that are being harmed. And that is a very important thing for me to do, especially because that fits with my worldview and understanding that humans have a susceptibility for pain and difficulty and hurt. That is something that connects us, so I'm not going to ever invalidate or try to ignore people that are actively in pain or people that need advocacy. As we wrap up, let me really quickly share a little bit about my background. These are probably things I will delve into more in future episodes just as they come up, but I figured as I start and introduce this podcast, it might be helpful to give a little bit of insight into why I'm even talking about all this and what makes me feel like I have any ideas that are worth sharing on all this. First of all, let me start with pronouns, because I do feel like that is an important and inclusive place to start for any introduction. So my pronouns are she, her. You could really use whatever pronoun you prefer for me. I do know that most people tend to interpret me in a she, her way, and that is completely appropriate and congruent and fine with me. My view of my personal gender is a little bit more nuanced than that, but I'm completely comfortable with she, her pronouns. But truly, you could call me any pronoun, I would not be mad about it. I just am very curious and fascinated by the topic of pronouns. I know that a lot of people are kind of up in arms about it because they don't want to shift the way that they speak or have to adapt new language to accommodate people's identities. I think that that is a not very helpful perspective because it's not taking into account the fact that we have a common factor as humans, which is evolution of communication over time. So the way that people speak and communicate with one another, language, it all evolves in order to accommodate the new times, the new changes in society. And for that reason, I just think the argument that I don't want to learn a new thing or I don't want to change the way that language has been used, or they is a plural pronoun, so how could I possibly apply that to a singular person? My thought about that is, it is something that you are capable of. People are able to evolve their language and to accommodate changes that are inclusive and helpful and congruent with others. So it's a really important conversation that we'll continue to have. Because I believe the soul is separate from the body, I have a very special place in my heart for gender non-conforming folk who feel like their gender of their soul does not align with the body that they were randomly placed into in an avatar-like way, if you ask me. I can imagine that it would be incredibly distressing to feel like there's this obvious difference between the way that your soul feels and how that matches up with the way that your body presents itself. So that is something that I really see and have a lot of love for and want to amplify as far as valid needs and issues in today's society goes. I've also had the opportunity in my professional career to work with gender non-conforming folks. So let me back up a little bit. I grew up in the beautiful state of New Hampshire, which New England is just the best. I will never denounce it. I really identify as a New Englander, and even though I now live in Utah and have lived here for the last handful of years, I just love the East Coast. I love New Hampshire, and it will always have a special place in my heart. So I lived in New Hampshire pretty much my entire upbringing, and then when I was 18, I moved out and went to a little college in Virginia, Southern Virginia University. Ayo, shout out. And there I got my bachelor's degree in family and human development. I also got married at the ripe age of 18 due to my cultural upbringing in Mormonism, which again is another topic that maybe I can get into a little bit more in the future, but this is something I no longer align with, and in fact feel like, it was kind of a part of my identity that was placed on me just due to the culture I was born into. But luckily I've been able to kind of parse out the things that resonate with me and figure out my own belief system. And so at this point I am non-religious but a very spiritual person. After getting my bachelor's degree in Virginia in family and human development, I came over here to Utah. This is what brought me to Utah, to attend none other than Brigham Young University, which if you know is the Mormon university. And at that point I was still married. I was really trying to do the kind of conforming member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints thing ended up during my time at BYU leaving the church, at least in my heart and to the people that were aware of what was going on for me. You're not technically allowed to denounce Mormonism publicly when you are at BYU, but that is a process that I was going through at that time. I also got divorced. I also came out as queer. So in my mind, it was kind of a trifecta of Mormon no-nos that occurred for me just during my time at the Mormon school, which is, again, kind of funny, but it is just the way things went, and I am grateful that through that experience, I was able to, and actually forced to, look at things internally that I had been kind of suppressing or shoving to the side in order to be able to conform. And I'm in a much more content place of being able to decide for myself what feels right and to live congruently with my own values rather than kind of conforming to someone else's list or boxes of what makes someone worthy. So luckily during my time at BYU, I was encouraged and able to do a lot of internal exploration. Hello, Mercury. That was very necessary for me and really helped me to figure out what does align with me, what my values really are, and how I want to live my life. And I graduated with my degree in marriage and family therapy and was able to practice in the field of therapy for several years, specifically with the queer community at a clinic geared towards the LGBTQIA+ community in Provo, Utah, which is a very unique and interesting and lovely and magical place to work with the queer community, given that almost everyone I worked with over that time had some sort of intersection between the LDS faith and queerness. A very interesting intersection that I am fascinated by and was also able to study during my time at BYU. I actually conducted some research and created a thesis about transgender folks that had some sort of affiliation or upbringing in the Mormon faith. So I have really been honored and privileged to have the opportunity to talk to numerous gender non-conforming folks specifically that have this intersection between that gender non-conformity with a highly conservative and kind of high expectation religion. My family, which by the way, I'm the second oldest of 6 kids in a what I like to call mixed Mormon family, so some of us are still active members of the LDS faith, others are not, but my lovely family moved here from New Hampshire to Utah a couple of years after me. I guess they just could not stand to be away from me. Just kidding. I know there were many factors at play, but now my entire family is here in Utah, which is definitely part of what keeps me here. And I am like so happy to say that we have been able to figure out a way to include multiple different perspectives, belief systems, and just ideas about things into our family culture. I know that this is not always the case for every single family which is experiencing some of its members having faith transitions or creating their own belief systems, and I know that that's a privilege that I've experienced. But I did kind of, throughout my time in grad school, as I was learning about family therapy, treat myself as a guinea pig of sorts and kind of showed up to my family in a way that was testing the waters of what was allowed and seeing if there were ways to create a new culture that made space for me. And I know that that can be easier said than done, and I know that not every family, especially with these highly conservative religions, is tolerant or accepting of that. But I do encourage people to, on both sides, give themselves permission to be themselves, to allow themselves to present themselves authentically to whatever degree they can, express their beliefs and their feelings, and to recognize that the people around them aren't always going to see that the same way. This is what is going to lead to connection and people being able to maintain relationships even when their belief systems are different. That's not a bad thing. It's okay for us to have differences because, again, our differences, our diversities, our uniqueness is a commonality. To kind of tie in these experiences with my family with the rest of what I'm talking about in regards to human beings having certain things in common, yet being so distinct person to person, is just this analogy about cards, actually. My family loves to play just your classic card games. There's a few in particular that we're all hyper fixated on. There are some really interesting perspectives and kind of statistical ways of looking at how many combinations of a deck of 52 cards there are, it is pretty mind-blowing. This is a pretty frequent conversation topic in my family. Let me give you a little bit of perspective into that. For one thing, let me just say it clearly that no two shuffled decks of cards, of 52 cards, in this entire existence will ever be the same. Is that mind-blowing in and of itself? There are more potential combinations of that deck of 52 cards than atoms on the earth. Every single time you shuffle, as long as it's a full and complete shuffle, you are creating a combination of that 52 card deck that has never, and almost certainly will never occur again in the history of mankind. No deck is inherently good or bad. It would depend on the game you're playing. It would depend on your current and specific need for what kind of cards you're looking for. So yeah, there is no specific right or wrong way to be a shuffled deck of cards. I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this. People are the same way. If only 52 factors or variables could create such an infinite amount, it's really not infinite, but such an absurd amount of possibilities, then it's easy to imagine that as human beings, when there's such a complexity to experience and so many different possibilities of what we could be born into, or things we could learn, or things we could experience, of course, no two people are going to be the same. If a deck of 52 cards is not going to be the same as one next to it, like, people are way, way more complex and infinitely more deep and passionate and contradictory than cards. Yet, every single shuffled deck of cards is unique. So of course, we are too. And again, I just kind of want to bring this all home to my main point, which is that those differences fundamentally connect us to one another. And I think it's worth looking at the differences that exist within the realm of commonalities that we share. That really is my ultimate goal with this podcast, and I am so excited to continue talking to y'all in this format. If there are specific things, questions, or topics that you are interested in having discussed on this podcast, or having guests that may be specifically uniquely connected to certain topics, like, please tell me what those topics are that you want to hear about, because I do want to gear my content towards what is going to be useful and beneficial for people. Thank you so much, and there really is so much more that I hope to get into eventually on this podcast, and I'm excited to open up more of myself and my heart and just the way that I see things to y'all, even though I know that not everything I share is going to resonate perfectly with each of you. And I think, again, that's part of the human experience. You get to, from your own filter, decide what fits, what feels good to you, and reject and leave behind what doesn't. I really hope that instead of looking to me or someone else as some expert of your experience, that you'll recognize that you are the one that has more information than any other person about your experience, that you have the accessibility to understand yourself better than anyone else can. And because of that, can we all just try to respect each other and to give each other space to exist in different, nuanced, and colorful, beautiful, and magical ways? If I know anything, it's that humans are so deep and complex that I could possibly never understand just a person just by looking at them. And I think that inspires me to want to hear their stories and to, from person to person, open up that dialogue of what makes you you, what is your human experience like, what helps you tick, and then hopefully use those stories to reflect other people's stories and to give insight into what it means to be human and ways to be well. If you have resonated with any of these ideas that we've talked about today, please go ahead and give this channel a subscribe. Give me a like, a comment. Tell me what you'd be interested to hear about in the future. But in the meantime, stay beautiful. I am so excited to talk to y'all again soon, and hopefully with a guest next time. And I hope that you're having a good one. Bye, y'all!